All right, everyone. Welcome back to Status Quo is no longer an option. I hope everyone is getting a lot out of these presentations and this amazing group of people that we have here and is taking notes, thinking about your actions and strategies and interventions that we're all going to be talking about at the end of the day today when we happily welcome Dr. Barry LaValle back to talk about how we move forward in our coalition. So I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Cheryl Ward and Donna Wilson to you all. Cheryl Ward's life work has basically been social justice and decolonizing anti-racism education as the creator of the Sanyas Indigenous Cultural Safety Training Program. Donna Wilson is Executive Vice President at the Provincial Health Services Authority, and she actually holds the executive accountability for Indigenous health and cultural safety. So Cheryl and Donna have worked together on moving anti-Indigenous racism inside organizations, and they're here to share their experiences with us. So welcome, Donna and Cheryl. Take it away.
Thanks so much. Good morning, and I want to acknowledge by letting you know that I am on the unceded territory of the Nanaimo Coast Salish peoples, and I have lived here for just over 20 years now. I want to thank Elders Jerry and Charlie for your amazing opening, and also I want to thank you, Leslie, for your leadership and support for the space here so that we can talk about some very complicated and what I would call dangerous things. Next slide. So all meetings are transformation. What brings you here? I do want to introduce myself. I am Kokaukiwak from the Numgis First Nation, and I am the daughter of a very fierce Indigenous woman. I am also a mother, a sister, a partner. I began my career as a social worker, and for the past 20 years, I have focused my work and learning on racism, specifically anti-Indigenous racism. What brings me here is a thirst to understand and confront the racism and discrimination that targets my people. So this work is personal to me. I have skin in the game. And I also have a lot of hope for change. If I didn't, I couldn't be here anymore. I'm optimistic and realistic. I know that there is an incredible amount of work ahead of us, and this work is hard. Donna?
Sure. Hello, and thank you for the honor of asking a white settler to be part of this conversation. I've been listening to all the presentations this morning and writing notes, and lots of feelings. I have lots of feelings right now. I am speaking to you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. I'm a fifth generation Canadian with Scottish roots, born in Vancouver on the lands of the Coast Salish. My work has centered on really the psychology of human relations, depending on whatever or wherever I worked. And I've worked as an executive in more than 2 decades, for more than 2 decades, in a number of different industries, and now working in healthcare. And what brings me here, and I really appreciate this quote here, this question, is what brings me here is the desire to influence sustainable change, sustainable organizational and systemic change. And I also, on a personal level, I want to ensure I continue my own journey from one of bystander to that of ally. Cheryl, over to you.
Next slide. Thanks. So we're going to talk about three broad areas today. One is the context and background of the Sanyas Indigenous Cultural Safety Training Program. You've heard people reference this, and I want to talk about that in a little bit of detail. Next, Donna is going to talk about deconstructing anti-Indigenous racism and some of the frameworks that we have been wrestling with and moving forward. And then lastly, we're going to talk about resistance, what it looks like, what it sounds like, and Donna will close by sharing some of the learning we are experiencing while addressing this issue at an organizational level. Next slide. So the concept of the Sanyas educational program was initiated by Leslie Varley, and it's really important for us to acknowledge that. Leslie was the first director who was Indigenous at PHSA, and Leslie recruited me to come to PHSA to develop the educational program, specifically to address Indigenous specific cultural competency for healthcare workers. So that was the language at the time. And as you know, the theory has shifted to encompassing many different approaches, including cultural safety and now anti-racism. Grace Atkinson and I developed the framework and wrote the curriculum. And alongside this, we developed the incredibly complicated training platform. And I adapted a facilitation model I had previously created. Now, this work was really new in North America at that time, and that was probably like 100 years ago in technology time, if not more. There were no blended models. Online learning was really, really rare. So we were starting really from scratch. We knew this had to be an online program, and now it seems like a no-brainer. But at that time, that was really revolutionary thinking. Sanyas was always intended to be a foundational training. And part of that meant that we were building three basic pillars of change: increasing knowledge, enhancing self-awareness, and skill development. This is a model that comes from all of the work that was done in cultural competency. And when we really look at cultural competency training, you know, this was rooted in the US, and there was a virtual absence of work that addressed Indigenous people. So, I mean, there was a lot of room for us to move around this. And the program was under scrutiny from the very beginning. People talk about this now, but the reality is any Indigenous-led work will always be under more scrutiny than any other type of program. We had 10 evaluations, so roughly one a year, and I can state clearly that the model is stable and the learning is significant. What we've also learned is that the program is a lightning rod, and it has always been a lightning rod. I remember the first time we brought our advisory group together, we had set up all the curriculum pages in this giant auditorium, and it had every single task on the wall, and people were reading them, and then they had to either agree or disagree with the content. And this educator came up to me, who is Indigenous, and said, Cheryl, you better be able to back everything you have here up. And I didn't know what that meant at the time, but I understand now that that this person was extremely uncomfortable with the section that we were developing on anti-Indigenous racism. The one that dealt with racism, the one that addressed stereotyping, because we knew this is something nobody had really talked about in Canada yet. So we were taking big risks, and this person was justifiably worried about how this curriculum was going to impact them. So we're going to share a little bit about what we've learned about that. And what happens when a program tackles racism? What happens when we put when we illuminate the attitudes and behaviors of people who are complicit? Next. Excuse me. So moving forward, most people are familiar with these and many other mandates for change. At PHSA, the mandate that provided leverage in the early years was the Transformative Change Accord First Nations Health Plan. It specifically addressed the need for education. Next slide. Next slide. So this slide lays out a continuum, starting with a focus on cultural safety at the left, or focus on culture on the left, and focus on anti-racism on the right. Now, I'm going to talk about this because this was one of the very first hotspots we faced in the program, and that was the pedagogy, specifically the approach that would be used because of our decision to locate the training at the right end of the spectrum. This was a hotspot because there is a tremendous appetite for culturally based training and a heavy investment in this type of work. And I'll talk more about the tensions related to this later, but you heard Colleen and Barry actually also talk about this, that people have been socialized into the lower end of this model, and that is the approach that people are comfortable with, that has been invested. And what we're doing and we're committed to doing was developing the work on the far right. Donna, I think you had some comments.
Yeah, I just wanted to really add, as someone who has only been working on this in partnership with Cheryl for 2 years. Prior to this, I was involved in a lot of what was called cultural change. And it wasn't specific like what this is. This is huge. But what I will say is it takes time. And I think that's a theme that you'll hear us speak of through this presentation, is we have to be very intentional, and we have to realize this is going to take time. And Cheryl and I will be sharing with you a lot of the work that we're doing. And like Cheryl, I'm also hopeful, but I also have experienced how much time it takes to make a change occur. And I can say out loud that as recent as 2 years ago, using the word racism in policy development within a health authority was not accepted. Cheryl, over to you.
I see there's a comment about the model before, but it usually starts with cultural destructiveness. And that is another very similar model that's developed by Terry Cross. And yes, the bottom of that model is cultural destructiveness. And what we're trying to talk about here is what are the training models that we have examined and used to build the work that we do. So it's what we're talking about here is just a little bit different. Next. Thank you. So here's the basically the educational intervention. I just want to break this down a little bit. So at the very top, we have the SANYAS as a foundational training, a 101 intervention that addresses the gaps in learning that many people have, as well as tackling the other hotspot, addressing stereotyping, bias, and racism. So it's the 3 pillars that are used. This is really the starting place. And next, this would flow into the next step or phase, which is integration. So there would be a number of different initiatives that would really hardwire some of the basic core learnings into the organization, into the practice, into the point of care. And then finally, the third phase would be the nation-based, culturally specific education that some of us have been very critical about, in that when that approach is used without being connected to any other training, it can be very problematic. but there's obviously a need to do culturally based training. For example, if I'm working in maternal health, I need to know what cultural protocols are relevant here. In mental health, I need to know a whole lot about specific cultural teachings and traditional medicines. So it's not an either or situation. Really, we're talking about when do you teach what? When is it that people need to learn what? And this is a scaffolded learning model that is very effective. Next. So I'm going to talk now about some work that was done by Dr. Verna St. Dennis. She is an amazing Cree scholar we've worked with over the years, and I would really encourage people to have a good look at some of her work. We had Dr. St. Dennis do a presentation in the National Collaborative Webinar Series, and I've taken some of her slides and made just a few tweaks to it, but I consider this to be absolutely fundamental knowledge for all of us who are involved in this work, and especially for those of us who are educators. So what she has done is really examine the differing philosophical approaches to this field of education. Dr. St. Dennis poses that there is a spectrum with culturally responsive education at one end and anti-racist education at the other. I'm not going to go into too much of this detail here, other than to say her work is critical, important, and should be taken into consideration. And you really have to think about which of these dynamics leads to systemic change. And you can see that they are, I mean, there is some overlap, but we are really talking about two different approaches. Next. So as you can see, the two approaches to education will lead to different experiences. And on this slide, we're really talking about non-Indigenous people being positioned as, through the lens of culturally responsive education. Non-Indigenous people really are passive, innocent bystanders, admirers, voyeurs, spectators, consumers. And I see that and have seen that over the years when we have brought elders in, especially a decade ago. That was considered to be a very important thing to do, to bring elders into groups with little preparation to talk about their experiences at residential school. And this was very traumatizing. It was very violent, and people would be crying. They would be very upset. And I think there was this expectation that by talking about these experiences, it would lead to change, that suddenly or eventually settlers and healthcare workers wouldn't be racist, that they would treat Indigenous people with humanity, with care. And I have not seen evidence of that, which isn't to say that there's not a value to have these experiences shared. Obviously there are, but it can't be instead of the other critical work that needs to happen. So on the other side of the spectrum, we have anti-racist education, where non-Indigenous people can be positioned as oppressors and colonizers, implicated in oppression. And there's discussion about how people become advantaged through systems of privilege that Barry talked about earlier, perpetrators of inequality, investment in self-interest, and so on. And this is often a very difficult space to manage, especially for people who have never given one moment's thought or have done any critical insight into this work. Next slide. So another really important area in education is looking how Indigenous people are positioned, according to Dr. St. Dennis. Through culturally responsive education, we have Indigenous people as knowers with history. We become very spiritual, respectful of nature, etc. You will have heard all of these these ideas of who we become in the media, and how this sort of grounds itself in a place like healthcare is that will be the approach that people will expect to see. You know, they'll expect to see artwork, they'll expect to see the land acknowledgements, to have elders introduced, to have drumming and ceremony under that perspective. And on the other side of this continuum is anti-racism, where we also have Indigenous people as knowers, as human beings, as legitimate subjects, that with diversity, and that we are marginalized and unfairly disadvantaged. See racial dominance and white supremacist ideology as the problem. So you can see that this is a very different space, and one that makes it much more challenging. And I completely understand why people would focus on the left, why there would be an appetite for culturally responsive education, because folks that do that are rewarded by organizations and institutions, and especially by white people. The folks on the right are seen very differently, and I firmly am on the right side of this spectrum. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens to people like me when we do that. Next. So we've had a lot of learning. A colleague, Norjeen Hassam, actually warned me a while ago that identifying the problem means that it's your problem, Cheryl. And my experience has definitely played that out. And so over the past 10 years, we've learned a lot. And what I had underestimated was how deeply political the work would become. So I think I was a bit naive. The program walked into a political environment without the resources to address it. The SANYAS program normalized the R work. And I can say that when we started, it was unheard of to say the word racism. And Leslie talked about that in the beginning. When people have never confronted their own prejudice and racism, the work is hard. And when their behavior is implicated in medical violence, the work is even harder. Up there's a quote that being committed means to be endangered. I believe that was James Baldwin who said this. And I think that's probably something we don't often acknowledge, is how much risk and danger there is for those of us who are Indigenous, who are involved in this work. I also acknowledge there's risk for white people and people who are racialized, but I think the most challenging part of this for me has been the daily risk on a professional and a personal level. Now I'm going to turn it over to Donna for this next section. Thanks. Next slide.
So I just want to say to Dr. Colleen Varco, I have the privilege, the white privilege, maybe it is, but I have the privilege of being able to use the iceberg, which is the framework which I'm going to walk you through in terms of what we are using. And it's the framework that was developed through Cheryl and her team. But before I do that, I want to respond to some of the questions that I see people are asking around time. And that's why I did interject a comment earlier to say significant change takes time. It's not an excuse coming from a white person. It is my experience. And I'm going to tell a personal story that isn't, maybe some may not think is relevant, but it's my way of trying to relate to the lifting that we have to do here. And then I'll walk us through the framework. I joined the workplace in the 70s. And in the 70s, there was not just white supremacy, but white male supremacy. And 51 years later, I am, and you can guess my age because I wasn't a baby when I started working. We are still dealing with not having full equity between male and females in the workplace. That's still underway and working. So I use that as that's the framing I have from my own personal experience to tell me that as I join Cheryl and others in this work we're doing, I have to not be impatient, but I have to be intentional and continue to move forward. So I give that time context to you, those of you that are listening. So this framework I'm going to walk you through was really something I was first introduced to a couple of years ago. It's a model that's very helpful in that it takes the whole anti-Indigenous racism construct and it deconstructs it a little bit and highlights 3 key areas of leveraging that are very important and each need to be looked at and addressed, not singly and by themselves, but actually in parallel in order to make the kind of change that we are talking about today. And, you know, having listened to the presenters this morning, it is a huge journey that we have ahead of us, but I am optimistic that frameworks like this will help us. So I'm going to walk us through each of the 3 areas and emphasize how you would use this kind of framing to actually move forward and address systemic racism. One of the framings I've had as I've listened is the blindness that someone like myself has as a white person, blindness to the fact that I have privilege and blindness to the impact that has on Indigenous people and blindness to the history that got us here. And thankfully, Sanyas has taught me more about that history, in fact, than I ever learned in my public schooling. So next slide. So back in the very beginning, spring of 2019, it was pretty much my first day of joining Cheryl at PHSA and having this accountability, this responsibility to work in the area of Indigenous health and cultural safety. I attended an anti-racism think tank, and this graphic describes the dialogue and the conversation that took place. And I began to, it began to bring to me, lift some of the blindness that I had to what were harms and really what was going on. That even though I had worked with Indigenous people, one of the areas I did very directly was in putting together the 2010 Olympic Games. That was one of my areas of accountability. But I was really there only looking at what Cheryl has described of as the sort of cultural awareness or learning about the cultural attributes. I was not paying attention to the racism impacts. And this think tank really created a dialogue across the healthcare system. We had representation from ministry, from different health authorities, from community. And it really started to share really some of the data, some of the harms that were being told while people were being educated through Sanyas. So we'll move to the next slide. So the first part of this iceberg is really referred to as the interpersonal aspect of deconstructing racism. And interpersonal is about each individual and how we engage with another individual. And the examples you can see in this iceberg are examples of those kinds of interpersonal experiences. These are things that are seen by many, but unfortunately, they are not always understood and not always seen. And I really appreciate the conversation earlier today around microaggression. And the word around why is the word micro there? And I think there was an interesting discussion there. Part of that, from a white settler's perspective, is blindness makes it feel smaller. An eye roll was the example that was used. And I can assure you that many individuals are blind to the fact that something like that would be seen and experienced as racism. And so it needs to be identified. What I will say in terms of making change happen, we can't stop here. We can't just address the top of the iceberg, but we have to address it. And one of the things you'll hear from us, from Cheryl and I later on, is we are finding that people don't know how to address it. People assume they know the rules of play. And so we'll talk about what we're doing, the work we're doing to try and address interpersonal. Move to the next slide. Here's an example of different types of interpersonal racism that occur. Racialized violence, blaming, targeting, denying, weaponizing. And I think really the issue that I've really come to understand is that the people are using a phrase of we need a speak up culture, we need people to speak up, but organizations, and I'm in healthcare right now, are not making it easy for a speak up culture. They're not making it easy for people to feel that they can say something without worrying that there might be a backlash, whether you're an Indigenous individual or an otherwise racialized individual, or interestingly enough, even as a white individual, there's a different type of backlash that you might be concerned about. So I flag that as an important area of work. And I wonder, Cheryl, if you want to add a little to this section. Any comment or?
Sure. I'm just reflecting back to some of the comments that Leslie made in the very beginning when she shared that as we started doing this work, we thought that we would get fired, and believed that when we would push back, when we would start to speak about the problems, for example. This was a common conversation that we had. Is this the hill to die on? Is this the time that we're going to get fired? And I don't know how much of that has changed for many people who work here and in any health authority when people are doing critical work. I think that the weaponizing part of this is something we need to develop and to share our experience with, because weaponizing is when people use their ignorance and when they use their appetite for power to punish and discipline. Certainly I have been, and many others. So these are very real issues that come, not issues, but really things that happen when we are in the service of change. When we are performing in the way that the work culture wants us to perform, we don't experience these types of aggressions. So I think that as more people are involved in the critical work, we're going to see more of this. There's a comment here in the bullet, Cheryl, some of your staff need to check their tone. This is something that started to happen a number of years ago for me, and people would come to talk to me about a staff person, someone who's on the team that I lead, that they were really uncomfortable with something that that person said or some of the work that they were doing, and that I needed to fix that problem. So this is something that is ongoing, and as a leader, you know, this becomes another big bucket of work for us to do, is to manage these assaults and the aggressions for the people who are trying to lead and lead the change and do a lot of the heavy lifting. So, you know, the white supremacy, the violence, really it's the white lash. It's not just backlash, it's white lash about change. Thanks.
And what I'll add is, as a member of the executive team at the Provincial Health Services Authority, we are having regular dialogue at our executive table, and the thing that I'm working really hard to shift is, and we hopefully are shifting, is when you see something like this, it isn't that you go to one department to get this fixed. It's not the Indigenous health team's job to fix racial circumstances that are impacting Indigenous staff or patients. It's an executive team of leaders that have to influence and change behaviors and attitudes across the organization. So that is a dialogue that's underway, and I'm sure we're not the only health authority that's trying to tackle that, but it is underway. So in the next slide. So this takes us to the organizational section of the iceberg. And as I said when I introduced the framework, the reason why I just love this framework is that it talks about the different layers, and it gives examples of ways in which you need to, working inside organization, actually change organizational behavior and attitudes. And this really is where a lot of the work that you'll see us share with you later, PHSA is focused on right now. It's the introduction of policy, anti-Indigenous racism policy, and anti-racism policy as well. Huge gap, we didn't have that. And in fact, I recall a conversation I had with a well-respected physician at PHSA who really wants to see change happen, but was questioning why we were starting with policy. And they said, we know the rules. And it was interesting, the silence that occurred after that statement that was made in a group working on this issue, because I think everyone there realized suddenly that we don't know. We don't know what we don't know. Otherwise, racism wouldn't exist in our system. So this is one of the pieces that you'll hear more about us, but I think it's really an important area that you must go after organization, not just individual response in terms of dealing with anti-Indigenous racism. Next slide. So this really is, as I just mentioned, where we're working on. We're looking at the fact that we didn't have clear policy or any policy in areas. There was gaps in data, so we don't know how many people that work at PHSA are of Indigenous origin. We have gaps in data. We have ineffective reporting. We had a couple of different reporting processes that exist, very few reports coming in, virtually none coming in, claiming or speaking of a racialized incident. And through that then becomes a bit of a lack of accountability, a sense that, well, there's a team called Indigenous Health and Cultural Safety. What are they doing to help with, you know, that cultural safety? And Indigenous staff targeting is something that certainly Cheryl has spoken to you about on a personal level. So we had an interesting dialogue, or we at a town hall recently, and our CEO, David Byers, addressed the question you see in that bubble. And it was interesting in that he really had to say, look, there is a long history and many, many reports that tell us, that have told us more than once, that we do not deliver equitable health service to Indigenous people. We have an accountability to deal with that. But that does not mean we don't also deal with racialized situations for people of other cultures. Of course we do. but we don't place our focus on Indigenous people second. We have to place it first. It is what we have to focus on. So I thought it was a very compelling statement that he made, and I think, and it's something I strongly believe in. So I just want to share that with you. It is important for organization to start with setting up the rules. What is racism? Define it. What behaviors are not acceptable? Define it. And that is the work that we are underway working on at PHSA. Next slide. So then you get to the systemic level. And I would say to you that this is really a lot of the conversation that's taken place today as I was listening to the presentations, and in particular, Dr. Lavalley really hit hard on attitudes and beliefs that Canadians have, the blindness of white people to white privilege, really looking at really how that began at the point where North America was conquered and other parts of the world were conquered, and it has sustained itself and became, for people like myself, invisible to us until we have a situation that brings it to our mind. So this systemic piece is really important that it's handled at the same time. It is probably the most difficult because in organizations, you can have people like myself working in partnership with Cheryl, where we can have, actually prescribed influence. But for the societal influence, we look to our elected officials and others, and it really is a little more difficult, but it can't be ignored. So maybe move to the next slide. How do these manifest? The things you see there are things like that are systemic, or things like contempt for Indigenous people. You heard some examples earlier that Dr. Barco gave in terms of the gentleman in the wheelchair in the emergency room. Contempt or dismissiveness or ignoring. An ongoing colonial worldview, very, very strong, very, very strong. You can see it. I can see it when I look at other countries, and then I have to look at my country and realize very much that it's there. And tolerance for anti-Indigenous racism. I really appreciated Dr. Varco's comment around the practice that she was trained to do as a nurse in terms of, getting someone to undress, put a gown on, and get onto a bed, and just the implications of that once you understand the history of Canada and what Indigenous people have been put through, and just not even realizing that you're tolerating an anti-Indigenous practice there. So I think I will move us on to the next slide, because these two graphics to me are, they came from the think tank that I mentioned earlier. I find these to be fascinating and very, very impactful and helpful in that, there are a lot of forces that maintain the status quo. Many before us today have spoken of those. But what we have to acknowledge is what does maintain the status quo. And I know there's a lot of people kind of in the chat that are saying, how do we move this faster? How do we move this faster? The fact that we're having a conversation about racism so openly today, I don't think this could have happened 2 years ago. So we now have this open conversation, and the In Plain Sight report landed it on our laps. Actually, initiated because of harms discovered through science, interestingly. And we now can have this conversation. So now we can start to dismantle. But we have to be very aware of how difficult that will be. And I listened to a quote that I understand came from an Indigenous leader on Vancouver Island. And he basically says, you know, same old produces same old. We all need to slow down, to speed up, to make sustainable change. And I think that I'm not suggesting we slow down, but I'm suggesting that we intentionally take very careful, patient steps forward. And I think the dismantling is linked to some of the ideas that were put forward in the framework of the iceberg. None of this is new, but to call it out and to understand it and to acknowledge it, I think is a very important first step, and something that we all can share in our different roles. And certainly I'm working hard to make sure that PHSA is aware of these frameworks and what we need to do. So I'm going to move us to the next slide, and I know we're running through our time fairly quickly. So I know that it was interesting as I was listening to Dr. Barco earlier talk about the apple and how it isn't just a single apple. What we're using this single apple for in this slide is really to talk about the fact that anti-Indigenous racism is a wicked problem. It is a wicked problem is one that's interdependent on many factors. It's complex. It's sometimes perceived to be impossible to solve. And it moves while you're trying to solve it. And what I would say is if you don't try, the apple will rot the other apples around it, and you will have something that is really rotting. And I think the time now is that we are doing something about it. And you have more organizational readiness than you had before. But organizations aren't entirely ready. And I'm part of an organization, and we're working hard to make ourselves ready. But we have a long way to go, and we're willing. So I think you can see from this slide some key elements I will focus on is really education in itself won't change the problem. You have to pick key leadership that work as allies to shift practice, to shift the blindness away where it needs to be, and know that it's not comfortable. So Cheryl, I'm going to shift this to you now because we have to acknowledge that there will be resistance as we take this on. Cheryl, are you there?
Yes.
I don't see you though, so I don't know if your video is on.
Right. I am having some trouble with my internet freezing, so I may have to get off the video again, but yes. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about resistance. This will be particularly interesting to Indigenous people here on this conference, because it really will talk about what we have gone through, what we're going through, and what we will go through when we tackle anti-Indigenous racism on any of these levels. So resistance is active or passive, passive or aggressive, it's obvious or veiled, conscious or unconscious, and it is violence. Violent. This is an image that we first heard about in one of the conferences that Indigenous Health at PHSA did a number of years ago. We've done 2 international conferences and brought together very compelling thought leaders and scholars. And Dr. Emma LaRocque is an Indigenous scholar, and she did a presentation, and this is how she started it, was, how do I tell this to you so you feel good? And so those of us here who are educators and who have had to teach and explain concepts related to Indigenous history, white supremacy, white fragility, colonization, and settler privilege, to name a few, will know what I'm talking about. People don't tend to feel good when they are learning about how they might be oppressing and harming Indigenous people. People have been socialized into thinking that learning should feel good. I should be comfortable. I should feel so safe that I'm not going to learn. And this sets up educators who teach critically to experience resistance and even violence. Next slide. So resistance manifests due to obviously lack of commitment on any level, inadequate policies, training, lack of Indigenous representation, inequalities in access to goods, programs, and services. And we often talk about this, Jane, my colleague, talks about this as the bun fight. You know, with limited resources, limited funding, we are scrapping with each other over who's going to get access to those assets. There's also absence of sanctions when people are acting out, when Indigenous people experience harm and discrimination. There's also a lack of accountability. One of the other big issues that we hear about is structural rigidity, and I just want to comment about that. Is that a myth or is it not? I'm thinking about how quickly, and I think somebody mentioned this in the stream, how quickly the province, the country organized around COVID. And I think about other types of interventions where certain training was required or behaviors changed. We had 100% compliance on this or that. So we know it's possible. We are very nimble people. We work in organizations and a political context that can act very quickly. So the problem is it's about Indigenous specific racism. We also know there's ineffective monitoring and evaluation, and that there are very few Indigenous staff to act as change agents. And this isn't even to open up the discussion about should we be the change agents. You know, Barry talked a lot about the role of white people here, the role of allies. And I think that is something that will begin to emerge for sure. But we do have limited accountability for addressing racism. Next slide, please. So what does it sound like? All of these comments have been made to me, and fairly recently.
You might want to turn your video off, Cheryl, because you are frozen right now. So while we can't hear Cheryl, I think I'll give her a moment to get back on.
As though I was stupid, and I was just finishing off my doctoral work at the time, and so I mean I was just paralyzed and stunned. But this is just normal, right? These are the types of things that happen. And so what I have learned is that it is imperative that all change agents, allies, and Indigenous staff have a good understanding of the colonial narratives that inform these types of comments, and that you're able to
Cheryl did say she's in a place where her internet's not very strong, and that's too bad, because I was really interested in what she said. All I got was, because people thought I was stupid, and I hope that we can get her to go back to that point.
Sorry,
I was saying I think this is a really important presentation, and I hope we can just backtrack maybe, Cheryl, with your camera off and go back to the point where you were talking about your own experience when somebody said where I was stupid.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
That's what I thought of her presentation.
Yeah, it's my internet seems to be a problem here, but the comment there is
Yeah, Cheryl's on, but it's not on, Cheryl. It's not on, Cheryl.
That we wouldn't have really basic.
Cheryl,
Yeah.
we can't hear you.
Oh no.
Yeah. So what I'm wondering is if you want to, can we get you to call in? Because this is really important.
Was that with the one bubble that says, do you know what we mean by data? And actually Alicia was with me in this meeting, and it was to a very influential person in the organization, and we were bringing examples of racism and discrimination, something we have done forever. And he said, or the person said, do you know what we mean by data? As though I was stupid.
Oh, okay. And Cheryl's faded out again. She's like, she's not allowed to make that comment. Got it this time though, Cheryl. So somebody was asking you in a really condescending way.
Intelligent, that we are stupid, those types of things. And so the other types of comments that we hear are excuses, right? Excuses for not taking action, for reasons why they don't get involved in this issue. Like there's a lack of resources, I'm too busy, you're at the wrong table, I don't have, you need to talk to somebody else about this problem. Like all of these will seem familiar to people who've been involved in this work. Next slide. Okay, there we go, the next slide. So this slide shows some of the roots of resistance, and there are a lot more, as well as the ways in which resistance can manifest. There's some evidence to show that resistance to organizational change is basically fueled by fear. Rosabeth Moss-Cantor talks about some of the factors which underline the fear of change within business organizations, things like loss of control, like racism is embedded within organizational structures and systems, people will react. Resistance manifests in ways and has a range of impacts. Anyone here who is engaged in organizational change will recognize some of the manifestations listed above. You know, this is such hard work, and someone made a comment earlier about knowing when to cut it off, and that's something that was a struggle for me for a long time. And we started. Can you move it? Okay, there we go. So part of the work that we do is developing a lot of tools, surveys, assessments, those types of things. And this is one that was really interesting because it was addressing this really important question about why don't.
Okay.
Maybe Donna, could you pick this up? You're not having the trouble. You have my notes?
Yep. Okay, I'll do that.
Okay.
Sure. So what you have here is a self-assessment tool that Cheryl's team has developed, and they've done a lot of research around this tool. And it's one that we've been testing in different departments across PHSA. But we have not yet launched it broadly, but it is definitely something that we will be launching more broadly, and we're bringing it to the attention of our executive team and our board. And the responses to this kind of tool are very illuminating and very important for departments to see. There's a lot of confusion for people in terms of racism, a lack of clarity on how to report it if you do see something. And our response to this has been to develop a training program, and the training program is the Anti-Racism Response Training Program. It is almost over the finish line. We expect by midsummer, late summer, that we'll be introducing that program, and we'll talk a little bit about it as well later. But it really is a training program that'll help address some of the confusion that came to our attention through this self-assessment. What we're hoping to do is introduce that training as mandatory for all new hires at PHSA, and also mandatory for all employees that exist right now at PHSA, so that people understand what is racism, what to do when you see it, and how to deal with it. So I'm going to talk to you in the next couple of slides around other strategies that we're using, because as you heard us talk about the iceberg, we have to deal with deconstructing racism on more than one level. But this tool is one that will become very, very important on the organizational level across PHSA. So maybe let's move to the next slide. Another infographic that came from the think tank. I can't believe how artistic these people are that can create these things. But really, what this really talks about is the need to really get to the point where we understand each of us is human, and to, Dr. LaValle obviously was speaking and is referred to in this infographic. We heard some of his messages earlier. It really is difficult to intervene and change anti-Indigenous racism or Indigenous-specific racism, given the many, many years of privilege that have been preset from the moment North America was conquered. But I think you have to have some really significant strategies around it. And so what have we done at PHSA to try and make this, to get this started? And maybe move to the next slide. It takes people like myself at the executive table. We're introducing a VP of Indigenous Health to the executive table as well. But as I said before, it's not something Indigenous people should be dealing with. It's all of us, and white people in particular, have to play a very pivotal role of changing what has existed for hundreds and hundreds of years. So we're building a foundation, and we've talked a bit about this in earlier slides, but I'll just walk you through what this is shaping up. In the middle, with draft written all over it, are sort of the front pages of policy that we are currently developing. We realized we had a huge gap around anti-Indigenous racism and anti-racism in the more general sense. There was dialogue around, do you have one policy or do you have two policies? And we really felt strongly that we needed two policies. There are very distinct reasons why an anti-Indigenous racism policy is important. And there are reports and legislation and commitments that people need to understand exist, and that those need to be paid attention to and not ignored. Whereas you wouldn't necessarily describe that as much in the Act on Racism policy. What's interesting is there is overlap in terms of responsibilities of people and departments, and those are described in the policies. An interesting thing that's come out of these two policies is the need for a handbook around definition. Even back to the comments earlier today around microaggression, like what the heck is that? And what does that mean? But also some colloquialisms that are used that people do not appreciate are racist in nature. Describing the colloquialism, describing that it's racism. Those are things that will be coming into supporting handbook that will be coming underneath these policies. We also, on the far left of this slide, outline the work that we're doing to deal with reporting framework. I've mentioned this several times, Cheryl has as well. it was unsafe, we discovered, for people to report. Leslie, in her opening, mentioned the Safe app that the friendship centers have introduced. And in a period of just months, they're getting thousands and thousands of reports. And I can say in PHSA, we were getting none to maybe less than 10 over a period of a couple of years. There was something there that was telling us that there's a gap. People were not willing to report. And so we're taking a hard look at that. We've just outlined for you the areas that we are looking at, and we are going to create a new system. We're months away from figuring that out, though. And on the far right is the Anti-Indigenous Race Response Training Program that we mentioned in the slide before. So you can see that we're trying to go at this with education, with policy, and with process change. I will say that we have a cross organizational project team that got pulled together to work on this. So we've done a lot of this work with our internal resources. We have not depended solely on the Indigenous Health team, but they are completely involved in this and partnering with us. We've brought in external resources, Indigenous leaders, other experts in areas of racism. And we're only in the beginning. So right now we've got a draft that's been reviewed at the executive level. It will be reviewed in draft for input at the board level. We are engaging the community to get their voices, and then it will go back through for final approval. So a fairly significant process going through there. I believe this is the beginning of significant change, but it will take time. Move to the next slide. The building blocks are identified in here, and I haven't mentioned all of them, but I know we're running out of time. So I won't read through this slide other than to show you again that you have to go after this change using all three levels, in interpersonal, organizational, and systemic strategies in order to address it. And then I will move to the next and final slide, and then I know people have questions. What are we learning? If you could go to the next slide, and if Cheryl, if you can speak, please chime in after I finish here. But these are some of the things we're learning, is you really need to have the vision and strong leadership, and it takes guts. It takes guts for an Indigenous leader. It takes guts for a white leader to take this and really work through this and make sure change happens. You need change expertise. You need to be intentional around the change. And you've heard me talk about that, and Cheryl as well. It isn't something you can do on the side of a desk. You need to focus on this change now. The momentum has started. And I am cautioned when I listen to the quote that I mentioned to you earlier, to if you move too fast and status quo stays the same, you won't get change. But if you move carefully and slowly with intention and leverage each change to the next step of change, that's when you'll see real sustained change occur. The fact that we are having conversation about racism is a huge step forward from where we were as recent as 2 years ago. We need innovation to be able to deal with wicked problems. The example for PHSA is we have to look at our reporting systems, and if we expected those existing systems to actually enable us to move forward, we would not be successful, and therefore we're innovating and we're changing those systems, those processes. Expect resistance. You heard from Cheryl on that, and realize there will be backlash. If we continue to support ignorance, it continues to lower the bar of where we can go. So we need to be persistent. And I can tell you that it hasn't been easy, but I feel very much that we have made breakthroughs, and we have strong support now at PHSA from our board level. Our executive team is open and learning. They've all taken Sonia's, and they're really, really wanting to make sure we do the right thing. So with that, I'll just go to the final slide and say thank you for listening to me and listening to Cheryl. I have to say, I have a lot to learn, and this has been a very, very helpful morning for me. So appreciate you listening. And Cheryl, I don't know if you want to try and say anything.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay, good. So just wanted to apologize for the technical problems. Haven't actually had this happen before, but yeah, happy to take some questions.
So facilitator, Alicia, are there questions?
Hi there, I'm here, and I'm going to be joined with Annette, by Annette. Maybe we could take down stop sharing the screen so we can have a view of us. And there's Annette right there. And I'll turn over to Annette and just remind people to please put questions in the chat. I know we only have about 15 minutes, but we'll get in as many as we can. Over to you, Annette.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to Cheryl and Donna for your presentations, and to all the presenters in terms of prompting the kind of dialogue that we're having today. We do have about 15 minutes for some Q&A, and I'm going to lead off with a question of my own, and then turn it over to Alicia to offer up some other questions. My question is for you, Donna. It's a privilege to be able to speak with you in this manner today. Given your position as an executive VP at BC's Provincial Health Services Authority, I'm wondering if you can please comment on what is needed to support Indigenous leaders who are leading anti-racism work in their organizations, and who are also the target of anti-Indigenous racism.
It's a good question. Not an easy answer. I think that in this day and age, you need allies. And in order to ensure the voice is heard, you need access to the tables where voices are listened to. And right now, there's not a lot of Indigenous leaders necessarily at the senior tables of health authorities. That move is underway. I think it's a good move, but I also think we have to be careful that it doesn't mean that the one individual who happens to be Indigenous is seen to be the person who solves all of the issues. So it takes education as well for all of the executives. But I do see the move shifting. And you know, I think that the one thing that in plain sight, we have all these agreements. The recency of the in plain sight report is one where it was a very hard-hitting report. It was very hard-hitting on many levels. And it has led the health system to realize that it can't keep doing what it was always doing. So the opportunity is there to do things differently. I don't know exactly the full answer to that, what that differently is, but I do hear other executives saying that we have to do things differently. So yeah, that's about as far as I can go right now.
Thank you for that. I want to hold out the opportunity for Cheryl to also comment on what might be helpful within organizations to support Indigenous leaders doing this work. If you hear me, Cheryl, and if not, we have many other questions in the queue.
Sure. I just there are some things that in our program we instituted really quickly, which was to bring trauma therapist in. I mean, the very first really horrendous example we saw, we actually had to do a critical incident debriefing. So if you take that concept just further, the work that we do is very traumatic. It's very violent. So we have currently 3 trauma therapists who work with our team. We also have 3 elders supporting the team, and support caucus work and spaces for Indigenous staff to get together, really to talk about, you know, what are the skills, what are the supports that each of us need in order to do this work, because yes, it's very difficult.
Thank you, Cheryl. And Alicia, please proceed with some questions. Thanks.
Hi, thanks Annette, and thanks Cheryl and Donna. So we've got quite a few questions here. I know we're pressed for time, so I might try to combine a few of them if that's okay. So there's a few people who have commented on some of the, I guess, the emerging governance structures at PHSA, and I know Donna, you spoke to some of the strategies. So some of the questions are around the hiring of an Indigenous executive vice president. There's a couple questions on here, and so some of the things that could be helpful to talk about is, one is, you know, some of the differences in the way that other executive vice presidents might be appointed into their role versus the process of hiring an Indigenous executive vice president, and if, you know, what are some of the differences there and how can that be disrupted? And then another question also around, you know, with the opportunity with this Indigenous executive vice president, what can be done to make sure that that person isn't tokenized and that that person doesn't become the one who's solely responsible for addressing anti-Indigenous racism? And we can think of that in relation to the question that Annette just asked as well, hearing that Indigenous leaders are the recipients of racism, just as Cheryl spoke to.
So first of all, the first part of that question I will address, and that is that, you know, executives getting appointed. The whole issue around appointing people to jobs is something that is fundamentally needs to be examined. And I know that at PHSA, the CEO and certainly myself, who and other executives, he will not appoint permanently to any executive role. He might temporarily put someone in while he's recruiting, but all of the executive roles will be posted. That hasn't been the practice, acknowledged, has not been the practice. But I do know it is the commitment of the existing leadership at PHSA, for what it's worth. So what I would say, and I do think it is worth a lot, and what I would say is, in other worlds that I have worked, this issue is there too. And each organization has to stay very strong around the concept of fairness and making opportunities available to all, and not appointing, because as you can read about, you know, people often appoint people that are similar to themselves. How to avoid tokenism of this executive? I think the key will be to be making sure, well, first of all, this executive reports to the same person every other executive reports to, so there's a leveling of reporting relationship. And it's been mentioned this morning that health is a very hierarchical industry, if you want to call it an industry, and it is actually, in my experience, probably the most hierarchical area I've ever worked in. And so by having a reporting relationship that is equal to everyone else at the table, that will not be an issue. But what we will need to do is make sure that all of us that are at the executive table are committed to the fact that dealing with Indigenous races, anti-Indigenous racism, is our issue, not that individual role's issue. And I'll be a strong voice on that, as will the CEO. So I think that's going to take time and experience and a bit of education. Cheryl, did you want to add?
I think what I have heard developing in other places is this concept called top cover. A colleague has spoken to me about this idea that, and something that we really need to look into to protect leaders who are doing this type of work from the types of violence that we experience, and so that they don't become disciplined, penalized, and so on. So I think the issue of tokenizing is widespread, and it's an indicator, right, that there's a whole ton of more work that needs to be done. I'm sure I've been tokenized myself. And here's one of the interesting things I see develop is, as someone who leads, a pretty huge program area, that we, first of all, didn't get consulted on work that was done, and then we get over consulted. So we go from nothing to being inundated with work. And for us, it's really to figure out what is that line, right, where this is meaningful asks, these important, versus it's just another mechanism to keep us busy. And we do talk about that a fair bit.
And I'll just add another thing that I think, because this phenomenon that Cheryl's just talking about is one where people don't, non-Indigenous leaders are coming to Cheryl for everything. Does this work? Will this be good? Will this meet the needs of what we need to be sure that we're being appropriate in how we're handling something? And that, to me, just speaks to the fact that we need to strengthen the education, experience, and confidence of all leaders in being able to address Indigenous specific racism. And I think it's a time where people are all feeling very much that they are not equipped enough to deal with it. So that's partly why Cheryl's getting completely over asked.
Thank you so much, Donna and Cheryl. I have a range of other questions here. I don't know, Annette, if you have any on your end, or if you want me to go ahead.
Yeah, I think if you can go ahead and maybe prioritize one or two more questions, and then I realize people are going to be anxious to get to lunch.
Yeah.
Okay, so I might just kind of mention a couple, if it's okay, Donna and Cheryl, just throw out a couple of questions, ideas, and then feel free to answer which ones speak to you. So there's a couple of questions here that are asking you to trouble some issues. One of them is troubling the concept of land being conquered. This was something that was mentioned in the presentation. So I think that's one issue that people would like you to speak to, and also troubling the idea about gender and how do we include trans and gender diverse and two-spirit people in some of this work around anti-racism. And then maybe I'll just, there's those pieces, and I'll just say right now, there's also a question around benchmarks and accountability, and how do we create some kind of system, or how do we approach the issue of consequences or enforcements when people exhibit racism in organization. There's an idea here even around having an ombudsman or maybe an Indigenous advisory board. So there are some ideas, and we can think about those again in the afternoon, but please, your thoughts around troubling conquered land. How do we integrate, include trans, gender diverse, and two-spirit people in some of this work in your experience? And any thoughts on the idea of benchmarks and accountability?
Sure. Cheryl, I'll take the first one because that was my comment. And I would say to you that when I saw the chat, I went, oh, there's an example of a white privileged person using a general statement of describing history. That's all that statement was. And I apologize if it was troubling, because I was using it only to, anyways, that's all I'll say about it. I don't really have anything more to say about it other than to apologize for using it. It was not part of the material. Cheryl, do you want to deal with the gender issue? Because I know we are looking at that and benchmark.
Sure. So just for your information, I think it's next week we have a national collaborative webinar that is speaking directly about this issue, about sort of the broad area around cultural safety and gender diversity. So it encouraged people to look at that. I'm not an expert around that issue. I know that we as Indigenous people are very diverse, and there are many issues that intersect with our identities, including this. And it is another site where we are oppressed and become invisible and marginalized. Yeah, I just would really encourage people to have a look at that webinar that's coming up. And then in terms of the benchmarks, I really think, this has been a site of learning as well, and I sure hope I'm not the only one. And what is it that we consider success? Is it that we have, 200,000 people taking the same course? Is it that Indigenous people can now report outside of systems? I don't know. I think it's all of those things, and I think it's also about when Indigenous people have the same health outcomes as everybody else. So how do we create the metrics for that? Where do we create accountability for that? This is not a very simple process. This is not, people are still figuring this out. We as Indigenous people are still figuring this out. And my learning has been shock at the politicizing of absolutely everything here. And I feel that that's been extremely violent. And I'm not sure we are in the place yet of figuring it out as a group of people. And we talked about this earlier. All of us have acknowledged that the lack of resources makes people act in certain kinds of ways. So, I think there's some interesting work that's being done provincially around metrics. But when we still fundamentally don't have mechanisms to identify people in the system, how are we ever going to measure and manage this issue? So there's some very fundamentals that are missing, and until they're done, I think it's going to hamper the work, and the work is not going to be accountable.
Thank you very much for your comments, Donna and Cheryl. I personally have some more questions that I would like to pose, but I realize we're going to pause for lunch, and so we're going to be able to integrate some ongoing questions, which are themes in this dialogue, throughout the afternoon. I want to thank Alicia for helping to moderate this particular period, and Nancy or Leslie, would you like to give some instructions about the lunch hour and when we're reconvening, please?
Yes, thank you, Annette and Alicia, for moderating, and Donna and Cheryl, thank you for your wonderful presentation. Sorry that we missed parts of it. So I would just like to call on. Can you hear me? Okay. We're so lucky to have some of our, I think, Barry called them PhD plus people here with us, and I just would love to call on Charlie George just to share anything he would like to with us as we transition into our lunch break. Hi, Charlie.
Hi, CM. Hi, Tap. CM na Elenisia ya wasn't Muklwalap. First of all, I want to acknowledge each and every one of you that have gathered here today. We already got ourselves prepared for this discussion. So I thank you for having the strength to come and share and listen. And for those of you that have talked, I really thank you for sharing. This is this is something that we have lived with every day of our life. And we did not see this as pain. We just struggled through it because we didn't know where this was coming from, a lot of it. And it was interesting to hear some of you talk about time. If just to give you an idea for me where I'm at emotionally, I think about my grandpa. I had my grandmother and my grandfather. My grandfather's grandfather, I lived with my grandpa's grandpa. I lived with my grandma's grandpa, and she had all her grandparents. My grandparents still had their grandparents. So when St. Mary's closed, I was already like in my third year of school. So I was already in school when they decided to close St. Mary's. So anybody in my age, anybody older than me would have attended Kamloops, Mission. All of these, we're very, very familiar with the names and the locations. We know what these buildings look like. My grandpa Charlie, I grew up with my grandpa until I was a grown man. My grandpa was born, and then the Indian Act was written. My grandpa raised me and held my hand. He put me to bed. He fed me. He clothed me. He held my hand when we walked. My grandmother's grandfather. So all of this beautiful work that you're doing, it may seem hard and ugly when you look at it. But all this beautiful work you're doing, like you listen to this one lady with her heartache. She said in 1985, racism has been criminalized. And here we are 4 decades later asking, how can we change racism? 40 years after the government made it illegal, we're taking a look at it now. So that's quite interesting to me that we, like for me, I feel like this is our first year of healing. And when you look at my grandpa Charlie and you look at myself, in my household alone, I'm not talking about my relatives that are in the house. I'm not talking about my village, my community, my people, or the nation. I'm bringing it down to a household of 2 people, my grandfather and I. And I have to share this with you. Canada had the Canada Reconciliation. They had 3 meetings. I went to the one in Port Alberni, I went to the one in Duncan, and I came to the one here in Victoria. I sat right from beginning to end, literally. By the time I was finished with our meeting in Victoria, I learned my parents went to school. My grandparents went to school. My great-grandparents went to school. My great-great-grandparents went to school. So you guys are unraveling, like between my grandfather and I, when we held hands, there was 100 years of experience when my grandpa held my hand, just between 2 individuals. That's not counting anybody in my house or my village. Between 2 people, we held hands and there was 100 years of experience. So I thank you for your work. Because now I feel like people would believe me now if I told them racism existed. I feel like I would be heard by somebody if I verbally said racism exists. Because the very first comment you hear about when residential school comes up the word, or if they see it written, they're just like, well, can they just get over it? When this is just the very first year of acknowledgement that something happened. So this is the very first acknowledgement. The healing hasn't started yet. And with me alone as one individual, you have 100 years of healing with just one soul. And we have 215 souls to take care of our relatives. So how are we going to do that when you have one person with 100 years of experience they could lay down and share and talk about? Because we can tell you what it feels like walking into a restaurant, sitting at the table with my parents, my grandparents, and my great-grandmother, and an elderly non-native woman come over. She put her jacket back on. She didn't get to order. And she tapped my great-grandmother on the shoulder. I'm sorry, honey. They don't serve your kind here. And the old lady walked out. She didn't even order. She came in, sat down, and she saw that we were still sitting there. And none of the waitress acknowledged that we were even there. And one of their regular customers came in and said, I'm sorry, honey, they're not going to serve you here. And walked out. Nobody would have ever believed me if I told them that. And I feel safe enough to share that with you today because you're going to actually, hopefully, believe me that that happened. Because nobody else, they'd laugh at you. They would laugh at you if you told them non-native people show their racism to us on a daily basis. We live with this. We live with the eye rolls. We live with the clicks, the noises, the sounds, the facial expressions. Sometimes we still get left standing at the door. People walking by without even acknowledging that you're there as a person. Those are feelings that we don't get to describe to you. Those are things we don't get to show to you because we live with it on a daily basis and we have learned how to deal with it. So now you're building a healthier way of dealing with it. You're building us a healthy community. Our old people were so intelligent, they built a healthy community with their own two hands. Because if you ever want to find out how they built the pyramids, come see how they built the longhouse. Oh, well, I'm sorry. But you think there's thousands and thousands of people in your village. And if one of our chiefs said, I need a big house, I need a longhouse for this ceremony, well, your 5,000 capable members are going to come over. And can you imagine how much dirt 5,000 people can move by hand? Teamwork, positive, healthy teamwork. They could build lift poles, 4 posts in the corners, build a structure. I mean, bury it under dirt. The whole village, just bury the house. And as it's getting unburied, they reach the bottom, the dirt floor, their house is built. They don't have any machines. They just roll the logs in place because the whole structure's buried. They unbury it and their beams are built in place. So they're not climbing up or down buildings. They built their own house with their intelligence, their knowledge, their people, their hands, their own 2 hands. The whole family built their house and they built a healthy house and a healthy community. So I thank you all for your work today and everything that you have shared here, because this is a pain we live with. And we're we're learning how to deal with it. And now we're learning how to deal with it in a healthy way. So I thank you, and thank you for allowing me to share. And to my uncle Sahilthit, is there anything you wanted to say, Shumnik? Okay. I'm going to share a song for you for us to break off for lunch, and I'll share that song for you. Hoy, 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 Thank you.
Hi, Charlie. Thank you so much for your wise words and your hope and inspiration. And we believe you 100%. We believe you. Thank you, everyone. We'll reconvene at 1 o'clock with Leslie, and Jerry will share some words with us at that time. Enjoy your lunch.